If there's one case that has haunted me and the rest of the world since 1996, it's the mystery of what really happened to Jonbenet Ramsey. The crime itself was bizarre and shocking, but what's even stranger is everything that's unfolded over the past nearly 30 years. And after watching the most recent Netflix documentary, I find myself with more questions than actual answers. Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we deep dive into today's biggest stories and share honest perspectives and spark real conversations. My name's Bacon Bears, and if you like what you see today, don't forget to like and subscribe. But today we're tackling the Jonbenet Ramsey case. We'll explore the most recent Netflix documentary, discuss contradictory information, and by the end of this video, try to piece together any insights into this decades-old mystery. Now, because this case is incredibly complex, I'll be breaking it down into subsections and then discussing each piece by piece. It all starts the morning of December 26th, 1996 in Boulder, Colorado. A woman named Patsy Ramsey wakes up around 5:30 a.m., planning to enjoy a nice cup of coffee before leaving on a private flight for her other home in Michigan. As she descends down the back spiral staircase, something catches her eye. 3 pieces of paper neatly lying at the bottom of the stairs. She picks them up, begins to read, and her whole world is instantly shattered. "We have your daughter." So naturally, panic sets in. Patsy races back upstairs, bursting into her daughter's room, only to find the bed is empty. And then she rushes to her son's room, flings open the door, flips on the light, searching for any sign of her daughter. Patsy then bolts downstairs, grabs the phone, and dials 911. And through tears and hysteria, she tells the dispatcher, "There's a note and our daughter is gone." Now, on the surface, it seems more straightforward, right? A terrified mother, a ransom note, and a missing 6-year-old girl. But as layers of this case begin to unravel, what emerges is a mystery so bizarre and so intricate that it still has the entire world baffled. Patsy and John Ramsey married in 1980, and this would be John's second marriage. John had 3 children from his first marriage, and together John and Patsy would go on to have 2 children of their own. Burke Ramsey, who was born in 1987, and Jonbenet Ramsey, who was born in 1990. The Ramseys appeared to be the picture-perfect family. They were wealthy, they were attractive, they were successful. Patsy was a former pageant queen who passed that legacy on to Jonbenet, who was also heavily involved in pageantry. And on the surface, everything seemed perfect. However, the family was no stranger to tragedy. Unfortunately, in 1992, John's daughter Beth from his first marriage was tragically killed in a car accident. And then in 1993, at just 36 years old, Patsy was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. John Ramsey would later say that after undergoing a year of chemotherapy and seeing her cancer go into remission, Patsy found a new lease on life. This gave her a fresh perspective, and she poured her heart and soul into her children. And from what we know, Burke and Jonbenet couldn't have been more different from each other. Burke was quite introverted, reserved, while Jonbenet was the polar opposite: outgoing, sweet, full of life, loved to be the center of attention and perform. But in 1996, life as they knew it would come to a screeching halt on the day after Christmas. At 5:52 a.m., a frantic phone call from Patsy Ramsey would be made to the Boulder Police Department in Colorado. Officers would then be dispatched to their home within minutes of the phone call. Now, I want you to listen to this phone call and tell me what you think.
911 emergency. Please, upon 15th Street. What's going on there, ma'am? We were kidnapped. Hurry, please. Explain to me what's going on, okay? There's a note left and our daughter's gone. A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old.
How long ago was it?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says SBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Patsy Ramsey, I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
Okay, I'm sending an officer over, okay? Do you know how long she's been
No,
gone?
I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please.
Okay, well,
Is she ready?
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath,
Please,
okay?
hurry.
Patsy, 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 Patsy.
Now, a lot of claims have been made about this 911 call. For example, the dispatcher who spoke with Patsy Ramsey later stated that she felt like the call was rehearsed. It's also been reported that multiple voices can allegedly be heard at the end of the call, according to the people who enhanced the audio. It said that Patsy thought she hung up the phone, but she really didn't. And you can supposedly hear John Ramsey saying, "We're not speaking to you," followed by Patsy Ramsey allegedly saying, "What did you do? Help me, Jesus." And Burke Ramsey reportedly asking, "What did you find?" Now, if this is true, and Burke was present during this phone call, it directly contradicts Patsy's statements to the police, because Patsy told the police that Burke had been asleep the entire morning. So if Burke's voice is on this phone call, it raises serious questions about why Patsy would lie about something like that. Now, I have to tell you that I've listened to this phone call, and I've also listened to it with my eyes closed so that I don't get influenced by subtitles or suggested phrases. And I have to be completely honest with you, I hear nothing of what the other people claim to hear. I don't hear it. Also, with enhanced audio found on the internet, a lot of things can be done to make it fit a narrative. So this is not something that I give much weight to. However, it was stated when this was brought up to Burke Ramsey in the grand jury indictment, they asked him what he thought he heard, and he did say his voice. So there's that. This ransom note is arguably one of the most puzzling clues in the Jonbenet Ramsey case. It's a 3-page document that has raised more questions than answers. We know it's written on paper matching a legal pad found inside the Ramsey home, using a pen that also came from the Ramsey home, which would tell you that the author of the note wrote it at the scene of the crime. But my question is, if the intention was to kidnap Jonbenet for ransom, why didn't the perpetrator bring a pre-written note? Why take the risk of writing it inside the house where you could be caught? Now, there's a couple of theories around this, along with the fact that you wouldn't write a ransom note if you had already killed Jonbenet. Wouldn't you just leave the scene of the crime? So for me, this goes against the intruder theory for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you had truly planned to abduct her, the goal, in my opinion, would just be to take her out of the home and take her to a second location. You leave the note, you take the girl, and you get out of there. Now, let's say what your intention was to do what you did to Jonbenet, and for some reason it evolved in the moment and she ended up passing away, and that wasn't your original intention. Why not just leave the house? It doesn't make sense to have a ransom note and a death in the same crime scene. But these are just the thoughts that haunt me every single day, because I've thought about it and I've reworked this part of the crime I don't know how many times. But let's talk about the ransom note itself. The content of the note has bizarre and peculiar details that stand out. It uses phrases like fat cat and good old Southern charm. I'll link it in the description box down below if you want to read the whole thing yourself. But to me, it's very overly dramatic. It's incredibly long. It states everything the Ramseys could do, resulting in Jonbenet's death. It addresses John personally. It uses words like attaché, and absolutely zero of it makes any sense. Another thing is the length of this note, which I believe has been stated to be the longest ransom note in U.S. history. Experts estimate that it would have taken approximately 21 and a half minutes to write this. And that tells us something crucial. The perpetrator felt they had time. Now, John Ramsey later speculates that someone might have entered the home before the family returned from the Christmas party that they were at. If this were the case, the intruder would have had hours to prepare. But again, if your true goal was to kidnap Jonbenet, why do anything to her inside of the home? However, if the perpetrator is already someone inside the house, they wouldn't have to worry about time constraints at all. Then there's the amount of money demanded, $118,000. An oddly specific figure. And it's oddly specific for a couple of reasons. Number one, it isn't typically rounded like 100,000 or 200,000, but it also exactly matches the bonus John Ramsey received that year. Now, John in the new documentary states that he left the papers on his desk containing the bonus amount, meaning that if someone came into the house and looked around, they could have used the bonus amount. They write it into the ransom note, and if this were the case, then the perpetrator would know for a fact that John Ramsey had access to this kind of money immediately. But to me, it's still a weird ask. Another striking detail in the note is do not call the police. They write it in there multiple times. Don't call anybody. There's a line in there that says, if we see you talking to a stray dog, we will hurt Jonbenet. However, Patsy Ramsey dialed 911 immediately. There was no hesitation. And then after dialing 911, she immediately called 2 sets of friends and I believe her pastor. Now, me sitting on a YouTube channel behind a camera, very rationally, not in a crisis, okay? My thought would be, why not call the police, tell them what's going on, that they have your daughter is missing, but you can't come here because we can't risk hurting Jonbenet. But then you call 2 sets of friends, which I also call my friends in crisis because I need somebody to be there in those moments when I can't be there for myself. So I totally understand. And then she calls the pastor, which also, again, I understand when people are, spiritually aligned with churches and things and, that gives them safety. But if you think that somebody is watching your house and they've stated that they're watching your house, you have all sorts of people coming in and out without the regard of what could happen to Jonbenet. Now, playing devil's advocate, Patsy could have skimmed over the note and only absorbed key things that stood out to her. We have your daughter and Victory SBTC. And we know that she read those things because she had said it in the 911 call. And it's possible that in the heat of the moment, that's what Patsy fixated on. But another thing that is quite strange and sits with me very heavily is that there are quite a few similarities between Patsy Ramsey's handwriting and the font style used in the note. One thing we need to remember is handwriting analysis is not considered foolproof. It's highly subjective and open to interpretation. However, John Ramsey was ruled out as the author, but they could not rule out Patsy. And now the Netflix documentary that was just released will tell you that they had experts that ruled her out, but you can also find experts who have not. And if you've looked at any trial, you will see that you have experts on both sides in the same fields that are specifically there to contradict one another's testimony. So in the new documentary, this means nothing to me. However, it means something to me when the writer of a ransom note has similar handwriting to someone in the home. The other thing they find is almost a practice ransom note in the same legal pad that the original ransom note came from that states Mr. and Mrs. and a straight line, which would indicate to the police that it was for an R, for Ramsey. Let's talk about this Ramsey home. This house is massive. And when I saw the layout, my first thought was this house is confusing. It's a Tudor style house that was built in the 1920s, and it's had renovations over the years that only makes this layout way more confusing. From what I've gathered, the house had 5 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, and several luxury features like a media room and a wine cellar. And at over 7,000 square feet, it's basically a maze. So with the complexity of this house, I don't believe that anyone could have navigated that house if they had not been in it before. 2 of the friends that were present that morning were the Whites, Fleet and Priscilla White. The Whites and the Ramseys at the time were best friends. They are no longer friends. However, the Whites are the ones that hosted the Christmas party on December 25th. They were also one of the first friends to be called after Patsy called 911 and they came to the house. Now, the issue that we have with everybody being in the house is we have detectives, we have victim advocates, we have the Ramseys, we have 2 sets of friends, we have a family pastor, and some of the friends, very innocently, I'm sure, were trying to start cleaning up and moving things and helping in any way that they thought that they could, but they are actively destroying a crime scene, or at least heavily contaminating it. And for the past 30 years, the Boulder Police Department has been absolutely ridiculed for their handling of the case, which, yes. And I'm not making excuses, but it is important to remember that this was Boulder's first homicide of the year, and it happened on December 26th. This was not a police department that was equipped to handle something like this. I believe one of the biggest issues was the failure to thoroughly search the house. For example, one of the police officers said that they couldn't get into the wine cellar, but instead of asking the Ramseys to open the door, they just simply bypassed it, which is interesting to me because in a report from Detective Linda Arndt, the name is redacted, but I believe it to be Fleet White, stated that when he got to the Ramsey home, he searched the house and he was able to get in the wine cellar. He unlatched the door. He was able to open it, but he couldn't find the light switch, so he closed the door back up, latched it again, and he didn't happen to see anything that was in that room. But the police stated that they couldn't get in because it was blocked or it was jammed. But whoever's redacted on this police report was just able to open the latch and open the door and get in? Which one is it? Is the door jammed or was it not? Detective Linda Arndt is the first the only detective at the scene to manage this absolute chaos. The ransom note said that they would get a phone call between 8 and 10 a.m. Linda Arndt arrives at the Ramsey home about 8:10ish, and she's there to make sure that everything goes smoothly with the phone call, to record it, to take notes. And one statement that she's made in her report that I've read in its entirety, and her wildly bizarre Good Morning America interview, is the fact that 10 a.m. came and went and nobody in the house said anything about the phone call, which I feel like the clock is the one thing that you would be focusing on. But again, people do strange things in a crisis. She also gave John and Fleet White some busy work to help keep them occupied. She tells them to search the house from top to bottom. However, a big point of contention here is that they go straight to the basement, and that's where they find Jonbenet. And I don't put any stock into the fact that she said search the house from top to bottom. It's not something for me that I take literally. To me, it's a phrase that means search the house in its entirety. And some people just really like to hold on to this point. I don't. Now let's play devil's advocate. There is a story that Fleet White actually called the police because his daughter was missing that year. He then searches his house from top to bottom or in its entirety, and he ended up finding his daughter hiding. John Ramsey and Fleet White at the time are best friends, and John knows about the story. So what if the thought process is, where would I go if I was a 6-year-old girl who was hiding? Maybe that's why they went to the basement. It wasn't truly a wine cellar, but it was also a place where Burke kept his toys. So maybe they thought she was hiding down there and playing, although there is a ransom note. So I guess that sort of blows my theory out of the water. Never mind. This case is so confusing. Anyways, Fleet and John go to the basement. They go to the wine cellar. They find Jonbenet. Now, in a later statement, Fleet will say that John stated, "There she is," before he even flipped on the light to the wine cellar. Just putting that out there. However, John picks her up. They both run upstairs. I believe Fleet tried to call 911 frantically on the phone, and Linda Arndt reportedly says that John had both of his arms out in front of him on Jonbenet's waist, and her head was above John Ramsey's. Her arms were up and they were motionless because she was already in rigor mortis, and they said that her lips appeared blue. She had a white string attached to her wrist. There was a bright red mark approximately the size of a quarter on the front of her neck, and she told John to place Jonbenet's body on the rug inside of the front doorway. Which... your doorway is a place where everyone walks in and out of, especially that day. Perhaps they take off their shoes, and you're just going to have so much dirt and debris and touch DNA just actively contaminating this crime scene. Linda Arndt said she noticed a smell of decay, and between the odor of decay and rigor mortis, it is estimated that the time of death was between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., which doesn't really tell us anything more than we already know at this time, because the Ramseys got home from the Whites' Christmas party at 10 p.m., Patsy wakes up at 5:30 a.m., and we know the rest. So John Ramsey leaves the room to go talk to Patsy Ramsey, and then Linda Arndt in her report states that she picks up Jonbenet and moves her again. But then John comes back, covers Jonbenet up with a throw blanket, and now not only has the house as a crime scene been completely destroyed, but we also have to remember that Jonbenet is a crime scene in herself that is actively being destroyed and contaminated. Linda Arndt reports that John put his arms around Jonbenet and he was crying, but she saw no tears. And Patsy immediately goes to her and lays on top of her, and the whole thing is just a mess. And now because John found Jonbenet, Linda Arndt has to interview him because he's the first one that saw her and he picked her up. And I know that some of you are going to be like, well, why didn't he pick her up? Why didn't he just call the police? But I also have to tell you, I am a mother of 2, and if I see my baby in distress, I'm going straight to them, and you're not going to stop me. So from a parental aspect and a parental instinct, I do not find this strange. But John Ramsey tells her that Jonbenet had been in the wine cellar lying underneath a blanket. Her arms had been tied. There was a piece of tape covering her mouth, and John had removed that tape. And then he grabbed her and he carried her upstairs. She also states in her report that John told her that she was right. It had to be someone who knew the family. It had to be an inside job. Once the case shifted from a missing person to a homicide, the police need to start piecing absolutely everything together, every single detail about the Ramseys' movements, activities leading up to the time, absolutely everything. According to Linda Arndt, John Ramsey mentioned that he and Patsy had hosted a Christmas party for their children's friends. She recalled that the event was an open house on December 24th, where the children decorated gingerbread houses. However, Detective Idler received a slightly different account. He was informed that the party actually took place on December 23rd and that the Ramseys had hired extra caterers to help. Also, which I find strange, at this party, there's a 911 call made at 6:47 p.m. The Boulder police received a 911 call, but when the dispatcher answered, the line went dead and an officer was sent to check it out. But they just determined that it was just likely a misdial from a drunken guest. And while all of this seems unrelated at first glance, every detail matters in an investigation like this. Now, what's interesting is according to Patsy Ramsey's book, Death of Innocence, she claims that Fleet White made the 911 phone call. He was trying to get medicine for his mother in Aspen, Colorado, and he just dialed wrong, and he got 911, and still to this day remains a mystery. But there's another detail that might be crucial to this timeline. On September 24th of 1997, about 9 months after Jonbenet's passing, a chilling incident occurred in Boulder. Again, a 12-year-old girl is asleep in her bed and is assaulted in the middle of the night. Her mother heard commotion, rushed into the room, and found a man dressed in black wearing a mask. She managed to fight him off, but what's super unsettling about the assailant is he reportedly knew the girl's name, telling her, "I know who you are." And the family claimed that the Boulder police dismissed this entire situation, treating it as insignificant, which any person getting assaulted at any time is never insignificant. But I digress. And the dad makes a theory that whoever this was in the house before they got home, and he waited for them to go to sleep. But here's where it gets even crazier. This young girl is said to have attended the same dance studio as Jonbenet Ramsey. Now, if all the connections are accurate, okay, this would support the intruder theory. Could this have been someone familiar with the Ramsey social circles? Someone who might have known the layout of their house, their schedule, and when they would be away. The part of the story when the Ramseys get home from the Whites' Christmas party has been debated for decades, and it takes on different variations depending on who you ask. Some reports state that Patsy Ramsey tucked Jonbenet into bed that night, but others will tell you that it was John. According to Detective Linda Arndt, she reported that John said he read Jonbenet a story, tucked her into bed, and then he went to bed. However, John would later state that she got it wrong. He put Jonbenet to bed and then went and read by himself. But in another report, he stated he was up playing with Burke and his toys. Some reports claim that Patsy and Burke went straight to bed when they got home. But then in a Dr. Phil interview, Burke stated that he snuck downstairs after everyone else. He wanted to get up and play with his new toys. Burke Ramsey has also claimed that he watched Jonbenet walk up the stairs ahead of Patsy. However, in April of 1997, Patsy reportedly claimed something entirely different from all of these stories. She stated that Jonbenet had fallen asleep in the car on the way home. John Ramsey then carries her up the stairs to her bedroom, where Patsy changes her into her pajamas. However, this would directly contradict John's account where he said he tucked her into bed. And what makes this even harder to piece together is that the Ramseys didn't sit down for a formal police interview until months after the incident. And that left plenty of room for conflicting details and speculation. So in 30 years, we still have no idea who put Jonbenet to bed or if she went to bed at all. What we do know is that Jonbenet's bedroom was on a different floor at the opposite end of the house from her parents' room. So if this was an intruder and somebody came into the house and was able to subdue Jonbenet, The parents wouldn't even know. As a matter of fact, one of the maids has reportedly claimed that the kids would sneak out of their bedrooms all the time. They would stay up, they would play, they would eat snacks because they know that their parents wouldn't hear them. And I have to tell you, I have kids the exact same ages. My daughter is 5 and my son will be 8. And not so much my daughter, but my son will absolutely get out of bed. He'll grab his own snack, he'll grab a tablet, he'll grab a blanket, go make himself a little buffet of berries. So these kids are definitely at ages where they are completely capable of doing that. Let's take a closer look at the crime scene evidence found at the Ramsey home. The first notable discovery is a broken basement window. Now, according to John Ramsey, he had broken it before and thought that he fixed it when he locked himself out of the house. However, investigators can't confirm how long a window's been broken, so that really leaves the relevance of this window to the case uncertain. But in the window well, there's an undisturbed spider web. And this is a crucial detail because if someone climbed through the window, like Detective Lou Smith later hypothesized, it's reasonable to think that the web would have been disturbed, but it wasn't. Inside the wine cellar, investigators found 2 footprints that didn't match any shoes in the Ramsey home. Below the broken window, there was a suitcase strategically placed so that it could be used as a step to make an exit, and on top of the suitcase, there had appeared to be a partial shoe print. Also on the wall underneath the window, there was like a shoe slide print down the wall, furthering the theory that this is what the intruder used to exit the home. Near Jonbenet's body, detectives discovered a footprint believed to belong to a high-tech hiking boot. Again, this print didn't match any shoes in the house, raising the possibility of the intruder theory. In an article that I found, it mentioned a pubic hair was found on the blanket Jonbenet was wrapped in. But in a second article, it was described as either a pubic hair or auxiliary hair. But this is the kind of hair that is found in armpits after puberty. If this is accurate, and that rules out Burke Ramsey, who was only 9 years old at the time. Investigators also find a rope on the bed in Jonbenet's room. It didn't belong to the Ramseys. And then they found the second half of a paintbrush that was used on Jonbenet Ramsey, which was found in Patsy's art supplies. Other items like the duct tape and the cord that were used on Jonbenet were not found in the Ramsey home. And again, this would suggest that the materials were brought in by someone outside of the house. Reports indicate that her long johns and her bed had urine stains, and it's believed that her clothes had been changed at some point, which Patsy stated that she did change her clothes. And also, let's not forget that it's not unlikely for someone to lose their bowels when they pass away. It's also reported that the underwear that she was found in was way too big for her, but as the mother of a daughter who gets hand-me-downs, my daughter actually has access to clothes that are entirely too big for her. So could it be possible that Jonbenet wet her bed on accident and then changed herself? Because I know that's something my daughter would do or is capable of doing. However, my daughter would come get me to tell me if she had an accident. One of the most puzzling actions from the Ramseys that does not sit right with me at all was the reluctance to turn over their clothing. And while investigators requested their clothes, the Ramseys only turned in a limited selection a year later, including 2 shirts, 1 pair of pants, and a sweater. But there were 3 other people in that house besides Jonbenet: Patsy, John, and Burke. So let's think about this logically. There should have been a full set of clothing for each person, including underwear, socks, coats, and so on. I do not like that these things were not handed over immediately. Pajamas, but I'm even more upset that the police didn't require it immediately. However, I do think it's important that we talk about the duct tape. It is reported that the FBI identified beaver hair on the sticky side of the tape found across Jonbenet's mouth. Now, you have to remember that John did take it off, and if he had flung it somewhere, then perhaps it could pick up debris. And this detail seems random at first. It gains a lot of significance when we learn that Patsy reportedly owned a fur coat and fur boots. I believe one or the other containing beaver hair. However, you will be very happy to know that a warrant was never issued for these items, leaving this clue completely unexplored. In another report, I found that there was a red fiber in the tape, and that actually matched the sweater that Patsy Ramsey was wearing that night. Listen, I know that this is an ongoing investigation, and that really limits what we're going to have access to. It's not like it's closed. You can just go in and read the discovery. They don't allow you to do that. So I'm just going by what I was able to find online. And I never would have thought that one of the biggest arguments in this case would be over fruit. One of the most debated clues in this case is a bowl of pineapple. On the dining table, investigators found a bowl of pineapple mixed with milk alongside an empty cup containing a tea bag. And this might not seem like a lot at first, but let's unpack it. Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints are found all over the bowl. And when asked about this, she denied getting the bowl of pineapple. Now, playing devil's advocate, they come home from a Christmas party. They've had a few drinks. We've all been there. I've been there. And perhaps she doesn't recall handling the bowl. Or maybe her prints were on it simply because she was the one who put the dishes away. However, the autopsy would later tell us that Jonbenet Ramsey had undigested pineapple found in her stomach. And this would suggest that she ate it around 11 p.m. to midnight, roughly 2 hours before her estimated time of death, which in a report was 1 a.m. And you could say maybe she had a fruit cocktail at the White's Christmas party. However, that dinner that she had at the White's house was said to be further down her digestive tract. And then we have this statement from the family's maid, who reportedly said that pineapple and milk was one of Burke's favorite snacks. So we combine this with Burke's claim during the interview that he had been awake that night, sneaking downstairs to play with his toys. Maybe he had also gotten himself a little snack. But my question is, if this truly was a cover-up, which some people theorize that Burke was responsible and the parents covered it up, knowing that the snack is Burke's favorite, why would they not clean it off the table? Somebody took enough time to wipe all of the fingerprints off of the flashlight, including the batteries, but not pick up the snack? And it's also reported Patsy claimed that she had no idea where the pineapple even came from, even suggesting someone might have left it out the next morning. But that's impossible because Jonbenet had it in her stomach before she passed away. And the other thing that I find very interesting is they barely, maybe, if I remember correctly, if at all, talk about the pineapple in the new Netflix documentary. They also barely touch on Burke. And for me, this immediately raised red flags. Because if you want to claim your innocence and you want us to believe your story, you have to provide all of the evidence. So let's talk about the flashlight that was found in the kitchen. The Ramseys claimed they had no idea where it came from, but the maid contradicts this by saying that she absolutely recognized the flashlight because Burke used to sleep with it. And there's another interview where John states that he did have a flashlight like this, but not the one that was shown in the picture. Burke himself has also said that his dad would use a flashlight when putting him to bed. And honestly, I could go on for hours diving into all the possibilities, but to keep this video from turning into a 3-part series, we have to keep moving. However, if you guys are super intrigued by this case and you want me to deep dive onto something else, leave it in the comment box down below. Now, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm going to try to keep this as clean and as sensitive as possible. I do not do well with graphic detail. It's not something that I want to talk about on my channel. If you guys want to go find all the graphic details, they are there for you on the internet. However, you will not find that here on my channel. I'm going to be talking about some more sensitive topics, so feel free to skip over this part, but we're gonna have to talk about Jonbenet, her autopsy, and the condition she was in. According to the report, Jonbenet had been sexually assaulted, and there were signs of trauma consistent with this. She had a small amount of undigested pineapple in her stomach, which suggested that she ate it shortly before her death, potentially as late as midnight. The autopsy also noted that she had blunt force trauma to the head, including a fracture to the skull, and evidence of strangulation by a garrote made from a nylon cord and a broken paintbrush. Additionally, it was found that Jonbenet's clothing, specifically her long johns, showed signs of bedwetting, which could imply that she had an accident that night. The autopsy also indicated that Jonbenet's injuries, especially the neck wounds, were consistent with being caused by someone with knowledge of how to make such a device, the garrote. Now, this has been interpreted by some as pointing to someone who may have had previous experience with such bindings. Knot tying is something you may learn when you're in the Navy, which is where John spent, I believe, 11 years of his life. This was also something consistent with perhaps somebody that was in the Boy Scouts, which it has been reported that Burke was in the Boy Scouts. However, playing devil's advocate, going back to the pubic or axillary hair, could it be possible it was someone who knew the Ramseys with the knot tying experience. Perhaps somebody that was in the Boy Scouts with Burke. There were also marks on the body that have been argued that she was poked with train tracks that were in the wine cellar, and a detective named Lou Smith would later come to say that those marks were made from an air taser stun gun. You will find people who can contradict both sides. One of the biggest problems that we have is we don't know which came first. Was it the skull fracture or was it the strangulation? We also know that Jonbenet was wearing a long-sleeved white shirt with a silver star embroidered on the front, a gold necklace with a cross on it. She wore a yellow metal band on her right middle finger, a yellow ID bracelet that bore the name Jonbenet on one side and the date 12/25/96 on the other. Someone had drawn a red ink heart on the palm of her hand. Green Christmas garland, like the garland decorating the spiral staircase in the house, was tangled in her hair. She was wearing long underwear and a pair of white underwear underneath with printed rosebuds and the words Wednesday in the waistband. Urine stains and several red stains were found, and a Dr. Meyer would state that the stains looked like blood. Evidence of vaginal injury was also reported by the coroner. It was also stated that that area appeared to have been wiped with a cloth. It was also noted that the white cord that was tied around her neck, a similar cord was tied around her wrist. 17 inches of cord hung from the knot of the cord around her neck, and the end of it was tied in multiple loops around the length of a round tan brown wooden stick, and that stick had paint spots and varnish stains, which was the paintbrush that they found in Patsy Ramsey's painting materials. DNA was taken from Jonbenet's underpants and fingernails and was identified as foreign, and reportedly it doesn't match DNA samples provided by dozens of family and friends, including John Ramsey. We do know that the DNA was reportedly identified as male. They also report that DNA can survive up to 5 days, and so the DNA underneath Jonbenet's fingernails could have been from experiences prior to what happened to her. Now, in the early days of the investigation, both John and Patsy Ramsey cooperated with law enforcement. They provided physical evidence, including blood, hair, fingerprints, and voluntarily gave 5 handwriting samples. However, as the investigation went on and media attention grew, they hired lawyers, which led to a decrease in their willingness to cooperate, especially as the police and media began to suspect them as being potential suspects, which I understand. Up until 1998, the Ramseys initially refused to take a polygraph test, but they agreed under one condition, that the test would be administered by an independent expert. Both John and Patsy took and passed the polygraph exam, although it was said that there were complications in Patsy's case. Steve Thomas, a former investigator in the case, stated that Patsy had to take the polygraph test 3 times with 2 different examiners before she passed, which means that she didn't pass the first time? I'm very confused about this one. Also, why is that allowed? Now, it's important to note that polygraph tests, while used in investigations, cannot be used as definitive proof of innocence or guilt in a court of law. And I gotta tell you, no matter what the case is, you're not hooking me up to one. After covering the Denise Huskins case, no thanks. So we have a body, a crime scene, evidence, and an autopsy, and it's also very bizarre. But it doesn't stop there, because it's also the behavior that continues on for nearly 30 years. And that is what just puts the little cherry on top of this insanity. So this section, we're just going to talk about everything else that I took down in my notes. When I think about the crime scene and Jonbenet's body, she wasn't just murdered, but this 6-year-old girl was tortured. A device meant to control and release was used in her death, and this, to me, suggests a level of rage and anger. That and everything else that happened to her points to something deeply intimate. This kind of violence shows a very personal connection between the victim and the perpetrator, in my opinion. On a separate note, this part, oof. I don't even believe, this is a fact, okay? Fact, write it down. I said it. I don't care. The media treatment of Jonbenet at the time, disgusting. The way that the media was able to speak about her, especially considering she was just a 6-year-old child, is absolutely shameful, and all those people should be wildly ashamed of themselves. The media really latched onto this idea of pageantry treating Jonbenet like she was the adult. They immediately focused on her sexuality, which is disgusting because she's 6, and the Ramseys were relentlessly ridiculed for putting her in pageants. Now, I'm not a fan of pageantry myself, and it's not something that I would ever put my daughter in. But I can understand why Patsy did. Patsy was in pageants, and sometimes little girls want to do what their moms do. For example, my mom played softball her entire life. So what did I do? I played softball for my entire life. I do hair and makeup. My daughter wants to do hair and makeup. It's a thing that kids do to bond with their parents. But the media wasn't upset about pageantry as a whole. They didn't care about the other girls who were in these pageants or the other parents who were subjecting their children to that. They directed their anger specifically at the Ramseys. Another thing that doesn't sit right with me is Linda Arndt's interview on Good Morning America. Because what was that? When I tell you that this was bizarre, just please go watch it and then come back and tell me after this video. Go watch it and then come back and tell me, because it's something. I think that if you're in law enforcement, there should be some sort of oath that you take that you can't do interviews for notoriety. I read her entire report and there was nothing in there that stood out to me that raised any red flags about the behavior that happened that day, except for the fact that John Ramsey wanted to get a plane and leave that day. That was an odd one. However, reading her report from the stance of a parent, everything she wrote in the report was completely understandable. But on Good Morning America, she talks about how she had a shoulder holster with her firearm in it, and she had to hold on to it and counted the fact that she only had 18 bullets, and she didn't know if she was going to make it out alive because she knew that the killer was in the house, and they had a nonverbal eye exchange. There's this big dramatic thing about how she absolutely knows who the killer is. It was a bizarre. It was something. And then you have Detective Stephen Thomas, who wrote a book about the theory that Patsy Ramsey did it because JonBenet wet the bed. And then you have a police officer giving details of an open investigation inside of his book. Also, we know that the police actively leaked things to the press, should be immediately terminated. But what do I know? Another thing that people find odd or doesn't sit right with them is that they lawyered up right away and they hired a PR firm. And I'm going to hold your hand when I say this, okay? We're poor. The majority of us looking at this crime are not millionaires. So for us on the outside, yes, this looks odd. But you also have two people who know that the police are looking at them as suspects in their own daughter's murder. Perhaps they're just trying to grieve their daughter. The media is salivating over her funeral and they just want to be left alone, which I would understand, because if I lost one of my children, leave me alone. And I'm going to stop you from typing on that keyboard right now because I'm not defending them. I'm not defending anybody because we don't know who it is. I'm just trying to look at all aspects of this case. However, one of the things that does not sit right with the public or myself is that they do a public interview and they have a sit down with CNN before they do a formal sit down with the police. And Patsy Ramsey is also believed to be heavily medicated on this interview, which, who did this to her? Who in their right mind put a woman who was on some sort of substance on national news? Because if that was John, if that was my husband, immediate divorce. Who looked at that situation and was like, yep, This is the idea. A lot of people didn't like the way that they were acting. People said that their actions at her funeral were staged and that Patsy isn't acting like a grieving mother and John was calm. But let's remember one thing. John Ramsey has already lost a child. And a lot of us would like to think how we would act in a situation like that, but that is a Band-Aid rip that none of us could ever fathom. And none of us would ever want to. I pray to God that I would never experience that once, let alone twice. And I will tell you, in my family, my grandmother has lost 2 children. And when I've talked to her about it, because she doesn't talk about it often, I can tell you that my family did not deal with the second one the same way that they did with the first one. They were very different in their own rights. Another thing that people like to speculate on is the abuse of JonBenet. In the new documentary, John Ramsey stated that their pediatrician said that there was no assault that had ever happened of any kind before that situation. But you will also find reports that will say that this was something that was long-standing. We spoke earlier about contradictory experts. And until somebody comes out with definitive information, that's not really something that I personally want to speculate on. Now, the other thing I think is important to talk about is the grand jury. The grand jury did come back and say that they could indict the parents of child abuse and putting the child in a position that resulted in death. However, they could only come back with the lowest standard of indictment, which would be probable cause. People say that the DA decided not to charge the parents because he was friends with them, but there's a really great interview on a channel called Mile Higher. I'll link it in the description box down below because I think if you're interested in this case, it is so riveting to listen to, honestly. But there's a man who worked on the case and he talks about why the DA didn't charge the parents. And I really think that you should watch that podcast. But in short, he talks about how they needed beyond a reasonable doubt. And they couldn't get that, so they couldn't go through with the indictment. And he also talks about how there's a code of ethics for DAs, and you can only charge somebody if you know that you could get them beyond a reasonable doubt. One thing I will never understand is why people want to cop to crimes that they didn't commit, because there were quite a few in this case. And there are quite a few theories. If you guys want me to make an extra video on that one, let me know. But the one that sticks out to me is John Mark Carr. He knew details that only the person in the room with her would know, which brings me to my next point, the DNA. A lot of you in the comments are going to say that John Mark Carr was cleared because of the DNA. And here's the problem that I have with that. If you are willing to use the DNA to clear suspects, then you have to be willing to use that same DNA to clear all suspects. I cannot tell you how much information I've taken in where they're like, well, they've been cleared because of the DNA. And yes, so have the Ramseys. There's a report that I read that in 2008, the Ramseys were exonerated from this crime. And there's going to be people in my comment section who were like, they were exonerated because they were friends with the DA. And I get it. Everybody wants to grasp on to what they know. But here's what we actually know. The DNA is incomplete. It's an incomplete profile. They had enough in the profile to be able to clear suspects. And if you're going to use DNA on some suspects, you have to use DNA on all suspects. Now, here is where I really think the Boulder Police Department really fumbled this, in my humble opinion, on a YouTube channel sitting in my basement. Look at the Scott Peterson case. There's no DNA, there's no crime scene, no cause of death. And yet he was convicted on circumstantial evidence. If they had secured this crime scene the way that they were supposed to, they would have been able to take more evidence that perhaps wasn't contaminated. And maybe this would be a wildly different outcome. So where do we go from here? If there is enough DNA to test from this case moving forward, we have the technology to be able to separate the profiles, because you have to remember that the unidentified male DNA is mixed with Jonbenet's. We also have an opportunity to do genealogical testing such as 23andMe and find a suspect through familial DNA. From what I've been able to find, this DNA has a low level of markers. I think they said like 9. And you can't just like test DNA, because you test that DNA and that piece of DNA is destroyed. But the pieces that they have are so minimal, they have to be very careful with what they do with it moving forward. And honestly, I feel like the DNA in this case has caused more problems than it's actually helped. Now, I've sat with this case day in and day out for weeks, watching documentaries, reading reports, reading articles, and I can tell you one thing. Any theory that you can give me, I can find a way to make it fit. And I think that's what makes this case so complicated. I watched the Netflix documentary, I went and did research, and I found myself with even more questions. I was happy just thinking it was who it was before I watched this whole thing, honestly. However, in my personal opinion, in my heart of hearts, I do think whoever did this knew the Ramseys well. And I've gone back and forth. New theories, old theories, weird theories. It's just so much. But I need to know what you think, and I need to know why. Because some people just want to throw out accusations and never explain it, and I need to know. I need to know the why. But if you like what you saw here today, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, guys, big news. Sorry, I didn't mean to be that happy. This is like a dark subject. I'm just really excited. We have memberships. So if you guys want to check those out, my name is Bacon Bears, and that's my opinion.